What's up, guys? I'm Dan, and I'm joined with Yasas today. We're going to be talking, philosophy, politics, whatever, typical cringe. But I'm going to try and hear Yasas out, see his point of view, and really understand what kind of, psychology drives him to hold certain opinions over others. So, hello, Yasas.
Hello, Dan. How are you?
I'm pretty good on this fine day. It's spring, and spring is great.
Yeah, it is actually reasonably warm.
So, how about we start off with this question? How do you find meaning in your life? I feel like that's a pretty. It would be a successful question for identifying yourself as a person without the typical, like, what are your interests, bro? Da 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 da. What do you find meaning in your life? How do you find meaning in your life? Yes.
Oh, that's actually a really hard question, but I mean, it depends on what I'm doing. Mainly just through doing things, I guess, because I don't like sitting around and just idling by. So in order to find meaning, I always need to be doing something. So even when I'm like procrastinating and doing anything, it's always been like working, like doing something. And if I'm actually being productive, it's always like working towards an end goal. And then once I achieve it, I always have another goal in front and another goal which I always try to achieve, so that I can always be like working towards something that gives my life meaning.
Does that give you your life meaning, or are you just kind of distracting yourself so that you never have to think about the absence of meaning?
Even when I'm sitting still though, like, and doing nothing, I still attribute it to doing something. So even when I'm like sitting still, I guess I just kind of categorize it under like reflection. So even still, I'm kind of gaining meaning out of doing nothing by reflecting on what I've done and what I need to do.
Okay. How about you define to us what you think meaning is, and we can see how that would be congruent with how you've explained it there.
Meaning, I guess, well, like meaning in the context of life, I guess, is finding purpose in what you do. And like feeling like what you've done matters, not so much to other people, but to yourself. And so you feel like you've actually gotten something out of life in general.
Do your repetition of goals lead to a certain higher aspiration? So, like, you can think of you've got a really large goal you want to attain at some point over your life, and you're not going to achieve it now, but through multiple goals that are far smaller and far more short term, you will hopefully build whatever it is, whether it's character or whether it's skills or whether it's discipline.
I guess out of that, I think I want to just be like the best at something that I can be, or like even beyond what I can be, like be good at something to the point where I'm able to advance it. Like, I guess an emerging field in the world, and I think that would mean a lot to me personally, and that would be like a big success, which I would really like to achieve at some point within my life.
So, being a leader in an emerging field.
Being a leader in an emerging field or extending one that already like an existing field.
Okay. Well, the former we can't really plan for, aside from making sure that we're as disciplined and adaptable, and our utility is all encompassing.
And being educated in like what we currently know as much as possible.
Yeah, staying up to date with general understandings in science, etc. But what about the latter one you brought up there, or extending a particular field? I take it you might have a particular field in mind that you would find engaging if you could extend it.
Probably IT, but even still, I don't think IT is very achievable for me currently because I lack the skills in order to be able to extend that, because it's already been pushed by people who know so much about it and have so much experience in the field, who've been there since like the 70s and the 80s, where IT started to come into the forefront of the world. And those people already know like all of the current expertise, and so they're able to push it even further, which is why I think focusing on something emerging will be better if I get skilled in the now, and then I am able to take a similar approach to them. Although even still, it seems really unachievable personally, because I don't think I have like the same characters and like the qualities that those people did.
But what qualities do you mean?
I guess like qualities is kind of hard to define. I think it's more just like their ideas and their capacity to just like bring an idea into fruition. I don't think I yet have that ability, and I don't know if I ever will, but it's a goal that I really want to work towards, because even if I don't get like fully there, I still think getting like the getting myself to be similar to that would be a good like character trait to have and something good to build upon myself.
By getting goals into fruition, do you mean coming up with the ideas or the practical element of actually producing it into a substantial project?
Kind of both, because I think it takes skills to be able to do both, but I guess if you take them into isolation, coming up with an idea and developing that is pretty real. Like in the world, it's actually quite difficult to do, especially given like if you look at any market sphere of like products being released, for instance, there are so many that fails and then like one or two succeed, and that's in like the niche of the market. And so having the skill to be able to come up with an idea that does succeed is super important, but really hard to do. And then it's even harder to be able to take an idea and be able to make it like exist. And I think being able to do both would be really good for me, but I don't think I can do that. So I want to develop like a bit of both individually, although based on current like myself currently, I think it's easier for me to take an idea and make it into something, like make it into reality, rather than like ideate from the start and all the way into a solution.
Interesting. So, as a summary for that, you'd say you find meaning in your life by completing multiple smaller goals that lead up to a broader goal of being a skillful person who can either advance a current field or an emerging one that has yet to exist.
Yes.
And in particular, you want to be on that very innovative side where you are on the forefront of producing new technology or products, and that's how it relates with the more software side.
Yeah.
So you like the tangible side, because when people think about an emerging field, often there's a lot of academics around that, but that doesn't really produce a tangible product.
I don't even like personally. I don't even mind the academics, and I don't really want to tie it into just software as a whole, because I'm interested in like, I guess even to an extent like literature, for instance. Although literature's super hard to quantify, so I'm gonna stick to like making products and.
Well, I was even talking about science, right? There's people who are at the leading of the emerging field, but not in the commercialization stage.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different skill. They're not thinking about how to practically apply it. They're thinking about how to investigate it so they can develop a proper framework of whatever that is. So are you still more on the commercial side, or do you also kind of find yourself fascinated by the scientific side?
I'm kind of fascinated by the scientific side of things because that's what gives me interest. Although the commercialization of something like that, if at all possible, would end up being kind of good because it'll enable me to take the profit that you're able to make from it and relate it to better stuff for myself. And like, I think being able to make profit out of an idea that you create and bring into fruition is really, I guess, empowering to yourself. And so I want to experience that empowerment myself.
And it would be highly satisfying and meaningful.
Yes. Especially since then the money that you made is, I guess, coming from something that you thought of yourself, created yourself, and sold yourself. And so I guess you being in control of the entire process really gives a sense of satisfaction to your earning at the end. And so then you gain like a greater appreciation for the money and what it provides for you, which I think, I guess, provides a greater sense of success for yourself.
That's interesting. All right. Well, my next question is, how do you think this philosophy of your life links into your understanding and opinions of policy?
Policy, huh? Okay. I guess, in a sense, I'm not really too sure, per se, because I haven't really worked yet or experienced, like, the effects of, I guess, government policy myself. I've only really observed it from the perspective of other people, like my parents, and what people on the internet, what people in person are saying. And so based upon that, my opinions kind of lean towards, like, Australia having a market that's slightly more deregulated from a, like, profit sense, although the government needs to take greater control for other aspects to make up for it, which...
Interesting. So, you mean... when you say, okay, so what in particular do you think should be more regulated and more should be deregulated?
I guess, so in Australia, for example, much of our profit comes from the export of like ores and mining and so on. And I think those things need to be, and that's extremely environmentally damaging. And so I think those things need to be more regulated so that we're able to be more environmentally friendly, because much of those like really big mining corporations and so on are part of those like 100 companies that emit like 71% of the world's carbon emissions. And so if we have those companies within Australia doing business, we might want to regulate them to a greater extent. Whereas in the general markets, we have people like selling regular products and so on, and not just on like I guess people setting up enterprise themselves. That should be slightly more deregulated so that people are able to do it to a greater level than currently.
So that it is more efficient and there's actually less resources required to be used.
Yeah.
And so we can actually reform our overall regulation system to pinpoint the area of maximum environmental damage to alleviate the externalities.
Yeah, so the area of maximum environmental and like human damage, I guess. And then if we're able to target those specifically without affecting the rest of, I guess, economic systems, that would probably be giving the best of both worlds for people.
It's also interesting that I find that argument because deregulation, usually one of the arguments is the increase of competition. But in Australia, it's not like the major primary resource producers like mining are particularly competitive industries.
There's no competition.
Environmentalism aside, they're already highly regulated for who actually gains entry into that particular field and sector. Similar to aviation, such that the argument for that doesn't really apply there as much as it applies for secondary markets where there is a lot of competition, because the only barrier to entry is really the price in which you increase after buying or while transforming a good. But you don't need the capital equipment to extract it from the ground, for example.
Yeah. But I think on the same vein as that, though, the lack of competition for those companies should mean that they're able to, like... I mean, the responsibility kind of falls on the government then to control them rather than for competition to. So I think the government should take a greater step to controlling those companies.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Those companies, there's less of an argument to say that we need to deregulate them because they already have very limited competition to begin with.
Yeah.
Rather as where you'd see maximum advantages from the secondary market companies who sell the products, who aren't getting the resource out of the ground, but they're selling a new product from that.
Yeah.
Who actually have a lot of competition, and where you'd see maximum benefit from repealing regulation there.
Yeah, for them.
Whereas the other one, it matters a bit less, and you want to try and reduce the negative externalities.
Yeah, so I think by doing that, I think it provides a benefit, both like I guess environmentally and from like a human resource perspective to like the damage that they're causing from the primary producers of like raw goods, and giving the benefits to the consumers of secondary products as well, because then they're able to get products of better quality and for cheaper as a result of increased competition in the market.
Where do you think the line is? At what point do you think it would have detrimental effects?
I guess if you allow the market to become so deregulated to the point where, in order to remain competitive in the market, companies would have to get like labor from I guess from places of, how do I word this properly, like I guess labor from poorer countries, for example, in order to be able to undercut the market to a low enough level, or resort to making products of like lower quality to be able to push them out faster, and then have consumers just rebuy with like the forced I don't know what the term for it is, but like...
Forced redundancy.
No, forced redundancy, like planned obsolescence with products.
Yeah.
Not even planned obsolescence, but rather like products that are intended to break after a certain amount of time, and so on, whose sole purpose is to be out on the market quickly, work for a bit, and then give the company maximum profit. I think...
Okay.
Yeah, that's probably like what might happen as a result of deregulation, which I think measures would need to be taken to stop, but I'm not too sure in what form they'd have to be taken.
Okay. Alright, so it sounds like a very interesting standpoint. You seem to have a nuance on where we should have more regulation and more deregulation. What's one area of the Australian economy that you think, or even just broader social policy, that you think the status quo is doing a very good job and of which Australians should be very grateful for?
I'm not too sure for Australia itself, because Australia's economy is kind of very small. Even though we're like a first world country and we're considered to be like within the Western world.
OECD.
Yeah, OECD. Our economy on the scale of global systems is actually quite small, especially if you look at like the size of like our stock exchanges, for instance. So I'm not too sure what we as a whole have to be grateful for as a result of the status quo. I think partially it's everything that we have in Australia, but I mean obviously like changes can be made to make things better. But on the whole, I think we should just be grateful for everything really that we have going for us in Australia.
The wealth,
The
the
wealth,
access to goods and
yeah, the wealth and
services.
access to goods and services. Although I think lots of steps can still be made in order to reduce like the wealth gap by the government, and I think that comes partially due to like I guess the fact that many large scale companies within Australia are paying like no tax still, which I think the government should tap into more and tax them rather than, and so then they can redistribute that wealth to the lower, like I guess to people and to increase up the overall.
What is your, to play devil's advocate here, some people would argue that taxing higher companies doesn't do anything because those taxes are passed on to the workers or the consumers while also disincentivizing investment in Australia. So where do you think the limit is when it comes to that, such that we don't actually make it too detrimental to set up a business in Australia, which is what fuels a lot of our economic growth?
I guess it comes down to the fact that like many like say take the American tech giants for example in Australia, when they trade, some of them do like I don't know any specific examples here. I'm just making a generalization based on like international patterns, but I'm assuming that some of them are doing like the same tax evasion strategies that they're doing internationally to pay like zero tax whatsoever in Australia.
Okay, I think that's very interesting, but I also think there's also a bit of a moral argument here as well as an economic one, and it's less necessarily whether taxes are wholly good or bad, but also a problem to do with the fact that it's uncompetitive to allow larger businesses, by virtue of their extra resources, to evade the tax system to get a competitive advantage over smaller businesses, especially in one that's basically violating the legalities of which we have set up here in Australia. Is basically an attack on the integrity of the Australian economic business system.
Yeah, I think what you said I kind of agree with a lot because if you do manage to tax those large companies, you're able to offset the amount of tax that's passed on to, like I guess not consumers, but like the everyday people who have to pay tax as part of their jobs, like as part of income tax, for example. And so by reducing that, you're able to, but still taxing large companies, you're able to net the same amount of money, while still and pass on that benefit, I guess, to the people who are living on the lower status of society. So they're able to get more money and afford and experience more things, which overall is a net positive for everyone.
What do you think our obligation is to reducing income inequality? Because you kind of addressed it there. What do you think are the problems if it gets too out of control? And where do you think a decent balance is where we can basically continue economic growth while having some level of income inequality, but such that it's still overall decently fair? Because I assume you'd agree that the idea of getting perfect income inequality sounds almost impossible, at least with our current understanding of economics, in achieving without a variety of other downsides, such as disincentivizing innovation and hard work, etc.
Yeah, I think with like reducing economic inequality, I think everyone should be able to work and not even work, but maybe even work with a minor amount of government support to be able to earn enough money to meet the cost of living of this country, to be able to afford accommodation and food without any like I guess struggles to do it. Although anything beyond that, anything beyond getting the cost of living, I think should be given to you as a result of your hard work. Because after that point, they turn into luxuries, which are not like needs, but rather wants. And so if you, like, all your needs should be provided for by a basic job. And if a basic job doesn't provide for it, you should be able to get government support that will cover the remainder. Although, if you do work a harder job or a higher paying job, for example, like, if you compare, say, someone who works at or like a retail store to a neurosurgeon, like the retail store worker should be able to afford everything, the basics that they need to like live a quality life, while the neurosurgeon should, as a result of their like, I guess, them being in an innovative medical field, being able to afford some more luxury goods as a result of their work.
So in other words, income inequality is important unless it is a consequence of some people working excessive hours and not some people being oppressed under like a tyrannical regime or high levels of class-based inequality.
Yeah.
So if people meet that certain threshold of basic needs or even higher needs but not luxury goods, not wants, then it doesn't matter if some people choose to work 80-hour weeks and get certain rewards from that create that inequality.
As long as the people aren't like being forced to work the 80-hour week to survive, it's fine, because I think you still need to get that work-life balance right. But if, like, say, I'll take my father, for example, who willingly works extremely long hours as part of his job, managing insurance. His choice there, because he's the one managing it, is that his employees get 40-hour weeks, whereas he chooses to work longer to cover for the work that they might not be able to do during their time. And so that's, like, his conscious choice. So he should be able to make that choice for himself. Whereas, like, the employee should not be forced to do, like, work beyond a certain level, like, to, like, extremely long hours, because that's probably not... It's not striking the right work-life balance. And I think you shouldn't be forced to have to do that in order to make a, like, living.
Yeah. And as somebody who has concerns for materialism, it certainly doesn't seem the case to me that everyone should be entitled to equality of some greater, higher standard, but it does seem the case to me that people should be treated humanely and be in humane conditions, and so needs should be 100% egalitarian, because by nature of the market, nobody really chooses to be, of a certain intelligence or ability, and in a complex world, that is effectively what selects for people who make a lot of money. That, and they have to work extremely long hours, so not everyone who's smart wants to work those hours, but everybody who is making a lot of money and choosing to work those hours is also very competent, and a lot of that comes down to nurture, genetics, and education, all of which they had no choice in from the sheer luck of where they were born. And so at least the basics, I think, need to be fundamentally provided. So my next question is, like, what do we define as the basics? Because some people would say, like, the basics are, up to quite a medium level income standard. Some people would argue that provided that other people earn so much more that it kind of has like almost a push-up factor, but by the eyes you're giving me, I take it you think that's a skeptical claim.
I think the basics should be defined as like what you need to have a quality life. I mean, defining a quality life is really hard though. So I think at the bare minimum, the basics should be in our modern world, like the ability to get food, get like quality housing. So housing of a modern standard that's high quality, has reasonable access to facilities or public transport, or the ability to like travel to places, being able to afford transport around the place. So even if it's either a personal vehicle, a bike, or like public transport systems, and having modern facilities within your house as well. So like running, well, not modern, but like living facilities, so internet, running water, electricity, and so on without fail. And those, I think, would be determining the basics for our modern world to live in.
And how would we quantify that in an economic standard? Like, would we have our own individualized HDI system? Or would we measure it on life satisfaction, happiness?
I guess it's really hard to quantify that, because if you quantify it on a scale, each person, in terms of like meeting those requirements, has different wants and different needs to suit their own living conditions. So I think it's going to be nearly impossible to create, like, I guess, a set of standards that everyone has to meet. Like, everyone's living conditions have to meet in order to say, oh, this person has met the requirements. Because each person might need different requirements given their interests or their work or, like...
Yeah, there's a subjectivity to what
Yeah.
we're satisfied with.
Yeah, I guess.
But that also raises another variety of implications because humans are a lovely group of creatures in the sense that there's people who earn, 6-figure, 7-figure incomes and still aren't satisfied by virtue of the way their brain operates. And so, in a certain sense, some people are miserable with everything.
Yeah.
So you can't necessarily even base it off what actually leads to what the individual views as a quality of life.
Because
Some people, once they earn their first million, become so hungry that they then need to earn the next one, and they never actually develop an appreciation or gratitude for what they currently have.
I mean, I don't think, like, creating a scale to quantify, to fit those people in would work then, because they'll clearly end up being, like, extreme outliers in that sense. Because regardless of what they're provided with, or what they're, like, or what they have, they're still never going to be satisfied with it, because they're always going to be craving more. So if you were to say, oh, this person's... I guess if we're still talking about the idea of, like, creating a development index to measure everyone's satisfaction, they're never going to fit, so... I'm not sure. Because in the example that you provided, obviously those people have enough money that every single one of their requirements is met. It's just that they're not happy with it all.
Yeah.
And I guess...
And here's another issue. I'm pretty sure they've done a fair amount of studies, this is pretty certain, that I think during the study they did it was up to like $74,000 until of income yearly until any extra income didn't have an effect on the person's level of well-being, which is, you got inflation and stuff. It approximates to like a low middle income Australian income.
Yeah.
Do you think we have a current system that would even be feasible for getting everyone to a low middle income level?
I mean, 74,000 in Australian standards, it's quite...
A little bit more now, so give it add a grain to that.
Yeah, it's a bit weird because the way Australian wages work, I guess, given Australia's like size and how widespread it is, you kind of have that divide between like public servants and regular and like private workers. And the way they're paid is completely different. And the way the pay structures work is really different too. Which leads to this vast disparity between like a public servant who on average would earn like 100k plus employed by the government in comparison to like wage workers who might be paid much less. And so that's what creates a weird 74,000 average of cost of living in my opinion. Well, I mean like average wage in this country, which then creates a massive disparity then because your wage workers might not be able to live because they might be earning like 50,000 a year working like at a retail job, whereas your salaried like government employees would earn way more.
They also, salaries get benefits, contractors get a lot more money.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily expressly a monetary figure you can apply to an individual.
Yeah.
And certainly during the middle of a recession, it sounds very difficult to me to have maybe, let's say you got like a negative income tax set at a point in which we're guaranteeing that level. That sounds such a large rate that even if it was economically feasible, it would serve as a disincentive. I think our current system's pretty good.
Yeah. On the whole it is, although I think...
There's a couple cases where it might be not enough or might be too much and doesn't incentivize people. I think in average it does enough to support people and incentivize them. So the real issue is like how do you guarantee a high standard of living for most of your citizens while at the same time keeping incentives in place?
I think, this is really interesting for me because I think in that sense, like if you take for instance like people who are unable to work or like unemployed currently, like I guess our current system assumes that they're all unemployed for the same reason and gives them the same amount of money regardless. Whereas I think you need to take it on a case by case basis because people get unemployed for different reasons, and so they might need different supports because some people might just straight up, due to personality traits or their own choices, decide they just don't want to work. Whereas some people are constantly seeking for work and they're unable to get it.
Yeah.
In which case, those people might need more support and they have like a genuine reason why they require support. In exception to someone who just straight up doesn't want to work.
We also have different types of unemployment. We have structural, we have cyclical, we have frictional, we have seasonal. And somebody who's frictionally unemployed probably doesn't need as much support because they already have the skills. They're just in between getting another job.
Yeah.
Somebody who's structurally unemployed probably needs a lot more help and training programs because it's an issue with their qualifications that's barring them out of the workplace.
Yeah.
Somebody that's cyclically unemployed needs support, but but only for as long as the economy's currently in a high unemployment. But then the moment we start recovering, they'll likely find another job.
Yeah.
And in seasonal, it's a matter of their qualifications being applied to a particular season, but not necessarily them being incompetent once that season rolls around and they're employed again. So it's not like they need necessarily the same type of training skills as a structured employee or someone, but maybe they need to diversify. And I guess that is a valid point. It's like at the same time, it would cost more to set up that system, but if it's more effective at actually prescribing solutions to people's problems, then it might save money overall.
Like, ideally, the system would have been to go through each unemployed person on a case-by-case basis, analyze the circumstance.
I think that's too unlikely.
Yeah, that's extremely unlikely.
Make it a system that's still got a template framework, but has components of the template that can be better applied. Like that was just an example I gave, the type of unemployment, but it could be other solutions as well. Like maybe you want to go to the next layer deep and have them do a personality test to identify what kind of work they would find more engaging.
Oh, and then assign provide support to get into that field.
Yeah.
That might be an interesting idea, but I think with the way we're currently doing things, I think providing support for identifying types of unemployment or reasons why you're unemployed and then tailoring, I guess, a selection of support programs to different types of unemployment would help the workforce. Well, would help everyone in general be able to earn money and get a better quality of life as a result of both gaining satisfaction from employment and from gaining greater money.
Okay. Do you want to move on to the next question?
Sure.
We probably won't do all these questions. I kind of added some side questions there because it linked better with what we were talking about at the moment.
Okay.
But let's go a little bit back to that environmental conversation we were talking about before, because environmentalism seems to be all the rage right now among us young folk.
Thing.
You mentioned a little bit about how you think the government should tackle climate change, or at least certain features of environmental degradation. But what about how much should the federal government overall, and maybe a better overview of other areas where you think they could or should not get involved in?
I think the government's job is to essentially run and manage the country. So as a result of that, I think it should be up to them to be able to set the policy and agenda going forward and how we're tackling climate change. And so they should probably be investing much more resources than they currently are into it, I think. Because currently the government's quite, I guess they're suggesting changes and they're saying, oh, we'll meet these climate goals and so on. But in order to tackle, emission producers and to cause, positive change to the environment that's currently being damaged, they're not actually doing as much as I think they can. And so I think...
Okay, but let me push back here, because everyone says they should do more. But what do you think they should do more? I mean, it's a complex issue. And we're a country that, relative to how many people we have, we pollute a lot.
Yeah.
But relative to the bigger countries, we don't pollute that much.
Yeah.
So, what kind of elements do you think we should be investing in? Innovation? Or should we be stopping certain industries that are polluting? What about micro-environmental issues that might not necessarily affect broader climate change, but culling the ocean or pollution in other areas that aren't specifically atmospheric.
I think for Australia, given how like much of our land is basically like the center of our land is basically like arid desert, and so and our like population is like centered around like the edges into like coastal cities and the greenlands, I guess. I think it's important that the government focuses its efforts on those areas in terms of like urban stuff. So I think Canberra is a good example about how much of our energy comes from renewable sources. And so in a similar vein to that, how we get like our electricity from dams, in other areas like Sydney, for example, you should, on the outer suburbs especially, you might be able to, the government could like set up wind facilities, for example, because those areas are naturally quite windy areas and they have lots of land because it's all flattened out for future housing developments. So in and amongst that, the government might want to consider setting up like solar farms or wind, which would help alleviate the energy costs for those places rather than set up new power stations. Because I know recently they sold to a Chinese company, I think, the rights to run one of those power stations. And actions like that should, I think, be stopped given the amount of money that the government's spending on those power stations and those facilities, and rather concentrated on green stuff going forward, which in the long run would save them a lot of money and also improve outcomes.
What's your opinion on nuclear energy?
Oh, nuclear energy, if done correctly, it's really good. Because if done correctly and managed properly, then it has very little downsides. Because all of the incidents that have happened with nuclear energy have happened as a result of human mismanagement. And I guess that comes from that's the biggest fault of it, I guess. Because in theory, those systems should all work fine and have so many safety precautions and everything done. But humans, I guess, and our ability to cause errors has resulted in things like like 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and like Chernobyl, for example. And so if we can harness nuclear energy safely, then it'll be really good for everyone because nuclear power plants don't take up that much space relative to the amount of power they produce. And they can keep producing power for an extremely long time. So overall, it's like a net win.
Mm-hmm. So, to summarize your overall point here, Yasas believes we should be putting more investment into reducing our current energy sources and diversify those energy sources into either renewables or into nuclear power, and lead Australia as an OECD country that's starting to resolve a lot of their emissions.
Yeah, I think even to an extent, like, South Australia like last year allowed Tesla to build that big battery here, which alleviated so much of their energy issues. Like during summer peak times, they didn't have to shut off power or have anything now because of that energy store that it created. Yeah. And I think doing things like that and privatizing out certain aspects of your energy grid, not I guess significant aspects, but like backup solutions or renewable ideas for your energy system, would also help alleviate the cost for the government themselves. And so it makes it more accessible to implement because the government doesn't have to have that overhead of implementation.
Yeah, and we have an excess of land here in Australia, as you said, and a lot of desert.
Yeah.
We can utilize that desert to allow private companies to set up grids like that. And we should be making it easier for them to do that.
Yeah, especially if
that brings up issues of indigenous culture, though.
Yeah, exactly. So if the land isn't being used and the indigenous people do give consent, or the land and give permission for these things to be created, then I think it should be fine to do. But if indigenous people do not, if it's of significance to them, I think their heritage should be respected and then alternate solutions should be found. So, which is why, like I said, on Sydney's outer suburbs, for example, on some urban plots, you might as well create wind turbines or a system similar to that where you're able to harness power without having to go.
What if people in that place also don't want a massive wind tower near their urban homes?
I mean, my argument on that is kind of a mixed bag because people have some pretty dumb counterpoints to why those things should not be built near the houses.
Yeah, but just to play devil's advocate here, the indigenous argument is very similar in the sense that they want their land, they want it to be maintained in the way in which they inherited it or bought it in the case of the urban home, And so in either case, the government would be having to put a wind turbine up against the consent of it. So are you picking a particular culture over the other?
I think
On
then,
what grounds would we make such a decision?
yeah, I think given the way that you frame that, because I was thinking more of the counterpoints of like all of the ones that you hear up on the internet quite frequently about how wind, like all the bogus arguments that they have against it, like oh, wind turbines cause cancer, the noise is bad, and so on, which are kind of false points against wind turbines. For like actual genuine concerns like that, I think alternate solutions would need to be found, and I'm not too sure what shape they're gonna take, especially in Australia, given like internationally, I know they've set up like offshore wind turbines to solve that problem, and so they set them up like 50 kilometers out to sea, and then they send it via like lines back to the coast, and then send it out to the grid. That way, no one's affected by the side of the wind turbines or anything, but they're still able to generate power and like on a much larger scale than they would if they're placed on land. But given Australia's situation about like say Canberra for example, we're unable to do that. So I'm not too sure yet what shape it would take, and I think compromises would need to be reached with like all parties in some way in order to go forward with making Australia more green.
Compromises, yeah. That's where it becomes far more hopeful, I think. The cynic in me wants to go, yeah, right, bro, you're kidding yourself. But I don't know. I think maybe there can be compromises with certainly, if you make the argument that okay, we regulate the mining industry more, but as a compromise, we deregulate much of the manufacturing and secondary market, like you were talking about
But
before.
the manufacturing and secondary market for Australian mining is international anyway, usually, because the production doesn't take place super often.
That is true.
In Australia, it's just the export that goes out, and then raw goods come back to us.
So we've got services.
Yeah, we basically just...
Would you be that would probably be the better example. It's services, agriculture, and mining. Mining, agriculture, we export out a lot of. Services are still internal here. So what about the pollution caused by the capital of which is required to enact a service?
Oh, I'm not too sure though, because you feasibly can't regulate it more without affecting the service and its quality. But deregulation would also cause much more pollution to be made by those services. So I think you'd have to weigh it up a bit more. I don't have any stats or figures yet to be able to actually quantify my argument there. And so I'm not too sure. I think you'd have to like actually analyze it in like a great deal of depth before deciding which policy you'd need to take on how to actually like how best you might want to regulate out polluters without having to deregulate out other polluters as a consequence.
Interesting. Well, I think we might wrap it up now.
Okay.
I think that was a good session about the economy and the environment and how it's intertwined. So it was good talking to you, Yasas.
You too, Dan.
And if we do this next time, we'll get a different topic and a different viewpoint.
Oh, yes.
But I'm enjoying the new studio, so thank you very much, Yasas.
Thank you, Dan.